If someone gave you $1 million, could you get to 1 million followers? Sam Korkos raised $67 million for his startup Levels and decided to turn his co-founder into a creator.
This was her full-time role for years.
But it wasn't just about getting any followers. It had to be people who'd become Levels customers in order to justify the cost.
We put a lot of work, thousands, sometimes tens of thousands of dollars of research into some of these pieces.
They learned who that was along the way.
People who own a Peloton and practice intermittent fasting have a 100% conversion rate into Levels customers.
But to reach a $300 million valuation and bring on investors like Andreessen Horowitz, they had to master a lot more than just social media.
You can see our SEO strategy evolve from day one. We would celebrate when we would get 400 or 500 views on an article. We're getting millions of views.
In our wide-ranging, tactical conversation, Sam told me his exact process for identifying and analyzing growth channels. Also, why organic growth might not be as valuable as you think, and why his old YC-backed startup actually failed. This is Sam Korkos' founding journey. So Sam, good to have you here, man. Good to see you again. And I think let's go way back to start, right? I think when you were in college, you almost never became a founder in the first place. Obviously, you've built some incredible companies since then. But I think if memory serves, you went down sort of the science and finance routes before you ended up going into entrepreneurship, founder life, and all that. So first of all, I'm personally glad neither of those things happened. But what made you change your mind and kind of shift towards startups?
I spent a lot of time thinking I was going to be a scientist. I really enjoyed biology. That was my favorite class growing up. And I worked at an oncology research lab out at UC Davis, which was a lot of fun. But I got pretty frustrated by the pace of academic science. I'm in many ways glad that I learned that lesson early. I have many friends who went down the PhD route and only learned that lesson 10 years in. And just how frustratingly slow it is, and how you spend basically all your time begging for money and grants and not doing anything that is as interesting as you would like to do. So once I sort of gave up on that path, I almost ended up going down the finance route. I went to Claremont McKenna, which at the time, pretty much everybody went into finance after graduating. And I almost went down that default path. And I was doing interviews for banks and realized how many of my friends had gone down that path and how they really did not like what they did every day, and decided that maybe that's not for me. So I ended up going into, I guess, what eventually became the startup founder path. Problem with authority and knowing that I would not make a very good employee. Yeah, I kept my burn really low and focused on ways that I could add value. And so that sort of became some early companies and kind of led me to where I am today.
Yeah, I mean, going into finance, that can be draining. The hours are crazy and the work is hard, but startups aren't easy either. Any regrets? First, let's talk about how a founder's life is endlessly chaotic. There's always a million things to do, but the thing is, a lot of those tasks are actually pretty low leverage, and they end up slowing your startup down. Thankfully, there's a way you can save up to 20 hours a week, just like I do: hiring an assistant. Athena's helped me and thousands of other founders and leaders backed by YC, Sequoia, or working at great places like OpenAI and Airbnb become better delegators and build leverage by bringing on a trained assistant. Less than 1% of their applicants pass their 6-step assistant screening process, and they're trained on the tools you're already using, even AI ones. The best part, though, is that they'll train you too. They have over 100 playbooks on how to be a more effective delegator. The result is that you wake up to inbox zero every day and save hours to spend on the work that you uniquely are able to do. Go to athena.com/Hauk and save $1,500 on signing up.
No, definitely not. I mean, it's never been a matter of hours. I think it's a bit of a misconception on the hours being the thing that leads to burnout. I think that they're maybe correlated at best, but it's certainly not causal. In my experience, I would say from the people that I know who have really burnt themselves out, some of them are only working 20 hours a week. They just hate their jobs. So if you wake up every day dreading what you're going to have to do all day, it's pretty easy to burn out. If you wake up every morning excited, you can work 80, 90, 100 hours a week and it feels like you're on vacation. So I think that's a bigger part of it. It's just if you're working in finance and you hate your job and you don't feel like you're really adding value to the world, it can be pretty soul crushing.
Yeah, I definitely empathize with that. I don't think I'd be a very good employee either. And I wasn't a very good employee at times. Okay, so then obviously Levels has become this incredible company over the last few years, but you had a YC backed company, Cardash, before this. And I think there were a few other companies along the way as well. Yeah, tell me about that.
Yeah, the first couple were bootstrapped, started with me and friends of mine that I knew from before. One was a high school friend, one was a college friend. I was the technical co-founder of those companies. They did some revenue, but never really hit a meaningful trajectory. So just kind of moved on, tried the next thing. Was doing a lot of software consulting during that time as well. That was mostly what was paying the bills. I found that the best way to enable that freedom to operate was just keeping burn really low. For a big chunk of that time, I was what I think is now called a digital nomad. I would live with friends. I would kind of bounce around and I would try to keep my burn super low. And that enables a lot of flexibility. If you have a lot of responsibility, if you have a car, if you have a mortgage, if you have expensive rent, you're really limiting the number of choices that you can make in your life. You have to pick a job that makes a certain amount of salary. It really reduces your risk tolerance as well. There's only so much risk that you can take when you have obligations that are piling up. So that was a really fun time and allowed for a lot of exploration. Cardash was a couple years, went through Y Combinator. Similarly, we hit a pretty big growth inflection point that got us through YC, and then it sort of leveled out. And so we realized that it wasn't going to be a venture outcome. So we sold most of the assets, part of an acquisition, and then moved on took about a year off after that company. And then spent a lot of time thinking about what I wanted to do next. And that's eventually what brought me to Levels.
Yeah, when I was looking into Cardash, and also just from our conversations, you guys hit what, like with 1 million in revenue in a few months. You did YC, you started scaling fast, you sort of hired a team to support that growth, like check,
Mm-hmm.
right? Everything kind of getting checked off. And then the organic growth kind of slowed, and you were in this position where you sort of didn't really yet know all of the growth levers for the business. And that sounds like a really challenging situation because you sort of built this to get to a certain point, and then things slow, and you're like, oh, what are those actual levers for me to pull? How do you manage that?
Yeah. Well, it was interesting because the whole time that growth was happening, it was all, as you mentioned, it was all organic. And we were talking internally, this feels good. Everyone says you want organic growth, but we don't really know why it's happening. And maybe that's okay. I don't know. And so we just sort of said, let's just roll with it. And then when it slowed down, we didn't really know why, because we didn't know why it had picked up in the first place. And when we started to run different experiments to try to get our growth numbers back on track. So when growth eventually hit a plateau and slowed down, we didn't know why, and we didn't know what levers to pull to try to get growth to start working again. So that was definitely a lesson in making sure you understand your channels and making sure those channels are repeatable. Sometimes you can just get lucky with organic growth and that lasts forever, but it's way better to understand your channels. So we spent a lot of time thinking about that at Levels, and it's a helpful and expensive lesson learned.
Yeah, I guess like contrast it for me, right? Like what have you done with Levels versus what did you do in that situation once you realized it at Cardash?
Yeah, I think it's at Cardash, we didn't really think about evergreen channels like SEO or partnerships or things that give you lasting long tail impact. I think where a lot of people get stuck is they get stuck in this treadmill where they're constantly trying to find these quick hits, these like one-off things to juice their growth, but they're not thinking about the long term. Whenever I look at our growth trend, I'm always looking for what is that long tail. When I see these little tiny, the one-time spikes in traffic, I don't really pay attention to those so much because you can't repeat those indefinitely. You really need to figure out what is that long-term trend that's growing sustainably and repeatably. When you end up spending all of your resourcing on Facebook, Instagram, Google ads, the problem with those channels is that your cost to acquire customers never goes down, really only ever increases with time. And so you're left chasing your tail, trying to find more ways to juice your sales as the cost of those sales is going up. And you end up in a really bad spot. So thinking a lot about how you can get your cost to acquire customers down, how you can do that sustainably is a really important part of our growth strategy. I think something in the range of, 80% of our acquisition comes through these organic channels. It's a pretty large number.
Yeah, I mean, you talk about those little spikes of growth. It takes me to the idea of like PR as a strategy, right? I think you see, even if you're just watching like Shark Tank or something like that, these companies come on there and they're like, we've had all these PR articles like right away so quick, and it doesn't really set you up for something that's repeatable.
Yeah, definitely.
Would you say that there is kind of still a place for PR in early stage startup strategy? Because I think it used to be the case where you could getting an article in TechCrunch about your fundraise was like the biggest thing, and now you can sort of build your own direct channels, right?
Totally. I think there's still value there. I would say almost all of them are going to be hard to specifically quantify, but they do exist. For example, there's some degree of credibility that you get when you're covered in every major publication. It's just a thing. We've run this experiment. I know other people who have run this experiment. There's a subtle uplift in conversion when people see that you've been covered in Wall Street Journal, New York Times, The Economist, all of the major credible publications. There's a subtle uplift when you have those links on your website. They don't even necessarily click on them. They just having that credibility by association is a subtle indicator of trust. I think another one that's very subtle, but is especially important for maybe first-time founders and entrepreneurs, is that credibility that you get from being covered in major publications. It might sound silly, but it can often be important for people's parents to believe that they have a real company. And so it's like giving credibility that's more to like their parents and their friends to see like, oh, this is a real company, for say employees on a team feeling like they work for a real business, not some fly-by-night operation. So those are some of the subtle reasons why press is important. But I think at different stages, press is more or less important. Right now, it's not a huge part of our strategy. It's possible that it will be again in the future, but right now it's not driving a lot of sales or any of the things that are on our roadmap.
Yeah, I mean, I definitely felt that subtle uplift when we did Launch House, because we got a New York Times article that actually before the company was even incorporated. Mm-hmm. And so there was definitely that air of, oh, like something's happening here. You have that kind of stamp of approval to some degree. But yeah, I'd imagine that strategy wise, founders' time early on is so valuable. It's like, how much time do you really want to put into that right away?
Yeah, for sure.
What would you recommend founders should do if they do see that kind of really organic growth early on, see those spikes coming in, but they don't necessarily understand why it's working or how repeatable it is? But what should they do?
The simplest thing is you got to talk to more of your customers. Figure out who they are, why they're signing up, where they're coming from, what their motivations are. That was something we did a lot more of at Levels than I have in previous companies. I've actually made a meme. Do you know the midwit meme?
My favorite. It applies to absolutely
Yeah,
everything.
it applies to a lot of things. I've made that for our team. Made it at some point in the past, but on both the left, the dumb guy and the Jedi just say, talk to customers. And the guy in the middle is like scalable A/B testing, performance marketing, something framework. But if you're not talking to customers, you're really missing the point. You should just talk to customers. And when you talk to customers, you find out, who are they? Why are they signing up for your service? What problem do you actually solve for them? How do you find those people repeatedly? I get a lot of calls from other founders and friends of mine who are talking about marketing strategy. They ask, hey, I notice you guys have a really successful SEO effort with editorial. How did you guys do that? And how do we do it? And the first thing I tell them is, maybe you shouldn't. It depends a lot on who your customers are and how you expect they're going to find you. We started with SEO and content because we knew that it would be successful before we even started. And the reason why we knew is because we talked to lots of customers. I interviewed hundreds of people in the first year of operation. And when you talk to them, you just find out who they are. What are they interested in? And in health and wellness, something that we found is people spend a lot of time reading about this topic. They do a lot of Googling. They follow people on Instagram. They follow people in newsletters. They listen to lots of podcasts. It's one of the most popular podcast categories is health and wellness. And so our entire marketing strategy was really downstream of what we learned from talking to people. So we kind of knew in advance, all right, these are the 10 podcasts we need to get on. These are the newsletters we need to get involved with. These are the things that people are Googling already, and they're just not finding the information they need to find. The strategy that we had was really downstream of everything that we learned just from talking to people.
Yeah, I mean, it's so simple but so smart that perfectly encapsulates the
Yeah.
to me. I always think it's shocking, when you talk to a founder and they're saying, "Oh, yeah, like we're building this incredible thing," and then you're like, "All right, well, what have your customers told you?" And it's very clear that they don't even understand who their customer is in some cases.
No. Yeah, like I would say that this is a frequent experience that I have, which is there's a problem with bike shedding. It's common in programming, but the bike shedding came from a guy who I think he was investigating something, or he was an economist looking at decision-making processes for how local governments make decisions. And there was a city that was deciding whether or not to build a nuclear power plant in their town. Pretty big decision.
It's a big deal.
Big deal. And when he was looking at what everyone talked about, they spent almost the entire time talking about what color the bike shed should be. Not about, should we build a nuclear power plant? And the reason is because everyone understands colors. It's like, I like green, I like blue, and you can argue about that all day. But most people can't think about the implications of these really important things. So people tend to fixate on what is trivial or easy or something that they understand. So all of that to say, when it comes to putting something in front of customers, it's really, when you're a software developer, it's really easy to build software. And so you tend to fixate on, I'm just going to build stuff. And it's like, look, you can show all your friends, look at this cool thing I made. Because you know how to do it. You can do it consistently. You don't know what's going to happen when you put it in front of customers. Usually, they're not going to like your thing. And that feels really bad. And so people tend to avoid it. And so I always try to tell people, you've got to put it in front of customers as fast as possible and get those feedback loops quickly. Because most of the time, people don't want the thing that you're building. And that's okay. This is just the normal path of how products go. So you have to get those feedback loops quickly. I can't tell you the number of times I have friends who start like a marketplace company, a two-sided marketplace. And it is usually the case that one side of the marketplace is really easy. It's usually the supply side, because your pitch to them is, hey, sign up for my thing and I'll give you extra money. Like, great. Yeah, I'm happy to make extra money. And it's usually hard to build the other side, which is the demand side. And the number of friends of mine who spend all of their time fixated on building the supply because they can and they win. And every time they sign up a new whatever it is, they count it as like a huge win. We built a platform for these people to do this thing. And it's like, great. How many customers do you have? Like, oh, tons. It's like, no, no, no. Those are not your customers. The people giving you money are customers. It's like, oh, well, we're going to do that eventually. Once we've built out the supply, it just doesn't work that way. You're wasting your time. If people are not willing to give you money, you have not validated that this adds value to anybody. All you're doing is wasting time. So it's really important to stay focused on what is the hard thing and what is the easy thing. And most people try to avoid the hard thing as long as possible, usually to their detriment.
Avoid bike shedding at all costs, basically.
Yep, definitely.
Do you think that there's any limit to what founders should go to their customers about?
What do you mean?
Like, for example, are there any types of questions you wouldn't want to ask customers? You want to rely on your own sort of like founder intuition rather than just hearing it right from your customers?
I think you should pretty much always get as much information as you can from them. Like, their experience and their opinion is always valid, even if it's not necessarily, how would I describe it? It might not necessarily be specifically correct, but it is always directionally correct. So what I mean by that is somebody might give you the feedback of, hey, your app here should do this. That might not be specifically correct, but what they're actually telling you is they're having a really hard time navigating, and your app is really confusing. I can actually give you a very specific example. When somebody gave us feedback on one of the parts of our app, they said, I wish that there was this like red flashing lights that said like, this thing is bad, it's not correct specifically, because if you did that, it would freak people out. Maybe not this specific person because they understand it in context, but most people don't. But what they are saying is they don't really have a good way of differentiating between good and bad. And so it would be nice if we made that a little bit more clear, which things are good, which things are bad, and give a little bit more guidance. So we've made a bunch of improvements related to that kind of feedback. So I would say the more information you get from them, the better. It's not necessarily specifically correct, but it is almost always directionally correct.
How often should founders like incorporate this into their sort of day-to-day, right? Because they're the ones who are responsible for this. The shortest information feedback loop is just them direct to the customer. Should this be something they're doing every day, every week? Like, kind of design that flow, that process for me.
It's going to depend on the type of product that you have, but I think part of the answer is often. In the simplest way of describing it, I would say almost all founders that I know do not spend enough time talking to customers. So most people are indexed way too far in the opposite direction. We have a rule internally, levels, which we keep track of. Everybody at our company, no matter their role, engineering, support, operations, whatever their function is, everybody needs to talk to a customer at least once a month. Talk to somebody either one-on-one or in one of our community calls. Everybody needs to have direct exposure to how people are experiencing our product. There's no shortcut to just talking to people. There might be some resistance. Engineers saying, like, I need to just focus on this. Talking to customers is not that useful. It's distracting. And then they do it. And you'll talk to a customer and they're like, why does it do this here? And the engineer's like, that's a great question. I'm just going to fix that right now. There's no reason for that to be there. That is such a great point. That's the thing. Somehow it never occurred to me. And the engineer can just directly fix it. There's no shortcut to just talking to people. You can have your theories on how things should work, but until the rubber meets the road, when people are actually using your product, you really have no idea how people are going to experience it. So that's been really important. And as I was mentioning before around not enough people are talking to customers, a very frequent thing that will happen is there are a lot of friends of mine that I usually informally advise, and they'll tell me how great things are going. Everyone always says how great things are going and like how great their product is and how they've made all these improvements. And I'll say, cool, what are your customers saying? Like, oh, customers are saying it's great. It's like, cool. And you specifically talked to them and they told you that. It's like, oh yeah, I talk to customers all the time. It's like, cool. How many did you talk to this week? It's like, well, not this week. I was really busy this week. It's like, okay, how about last week? It's like, well, last week I was also really busy. Okay, how about in the last month? How many did you talk to? It's like, well, not in the last month. I was really busy. Okay, when is the last time you actually talked to a customer? And if you pin it down like 6 months ago, if that, you've got to just have direct communication with customers. There's no shortcut to that. You have to see how people are experiencing. You have to learn from them.
I love that you have everyone on the team do it too. And I think that
Yeah.
that kind of approach, I mean, obviously led by the founder, but that approach in general, that's the type of thing that really builds super fans. That's the type of thing where people are like, oh, this company cares about me. They care about my problems. They're actually trying to solve them. Have you guys seen that at levels?
Oh yeah, for sure. We get feedback all the time from people who they say, I've never had a company reach out to me before and ask me for my feedback, which is weird because people interact with a lot of products and we ask for feedback constantly and we take it seriously and we very often implement those things. Some of this, I remember my brother was early at Notion and I remember seeing the magic of closing the loop with people where they would direct people to ask their questions when they see a bug or when they experience an issue and they have feedback to just post it on Twitter. And then often within like one day, they'll reply to them on their tweet publicly saying, hey, we fixed it. Here's the link. And it's a pretty magical thing when somebody posts something on the internet and says, hey, I ran into this bug. And then like 24 hours later, an engineer saw that, fixed it, and then replied to that person, letting them know that their voice was heard and that they fixed that problem. So building that feedback loop really builds a lot of trust with the people who use your product.
Yeah, I mean, it builds a sense of community around it, right?
Yeah.
Especially if you give your users places and spaces to kind of interact with each other too.
Mm-hmm.
You build that affinity one level deeper. You know, someone got a launch house tattoo when we were,
Oh, wow.
right? So how do you guys think about kind of bringing it to that level of community? And has that been a part of the strategy? And kind of what are the pros and cons you've seen with that?
The community is a challenging term just because everyone I've talked to seems to have a different definition of what that term means. I think for us, we do regular community calls where everyone can ask questions. Often we'll have an expert involved. We try to just get feedback as much as we can. We've had different initiatives in the past where we try to do more just direct member to member interactions within levels. And I don't think we've cracked the code on it yet, but it does feel like there's really something there. I think it's especially important when you have a mission driven company like we do on solving the metabolic health crisis. This is a huge problem that's global in scale. And so having people who understand that, who are bought in, I think is really important to being able to deliver on the goal.
Yeah, I mean, you guys have a very visible sort of piece of like hardware, really, that is a product,
Yeah.
not just an app, right?
Mhm.
Like, do you think that makes it sort of easier or harder? Are there other challenges that come up around bringing people in that close and creating that sense of community around the product?
It makes it harder in as much as it's less accessible because it's a physical good that is somewhat expensive. That's just the nature of the state of the technology today. We're working on ways to lower that barrier to entry to get more people involved, to help people understand how food affects their health. I think that's probably going to be the biggest lever, getting more people involved, is just to get the cost down. I think it helps in as much as because it's a physical product, people see you wearing it and they want to know what it is. It's pretty novel. So I think that adds a lot to the virality factor.
Yeah, I mean, so one thing that I've seen a lot of companies try to do is they try to build this sense of community, whether they're hardware or just flat software. I almost feel like there's a sense of community fatigue that's happening right now, where it's like everyone's trying to do community. It's the buzzword, has
Yep.
been for a couple of years now. Like, I don't know. Do you see that? Do you have an opinion on that? Is it kind of worth for early stage founders to use community as a growth strategy in 2024?
I think this maybe ties back to our earlier conversation, which is you should talk to your customers and find out what they want to do. I think in certain products, community will be a great growth lever because that's what people want to do. That's how people want to engage. I think a lot of people try to shim what they've read about that other companies have done successfully, and they try to force that into their own product. And I just don't think that's very successful. It's like what we were talking about earlier, where people say, how do we make SEO successful? It's like, you have a boring B2B SaaS tool. Nobody is looking for this. Like, this is not going to work for you. You can spend $10 million on SEO and you're not going to see ROI from that because this is not a thing that people are searching for. So the strategy needs to be downstream from who your customers are and how you access them.
I mean, okay, let's talk about SEO a little bit. I think a lot of people beginning of this year, or even last year, were saying, they were kind of rushing to say almost that SEO is dead and the internet's going to be flooded by a bunch of AI generated articles and everyone's going to get all their information from LLMs and ChatGPT. But, now OpenAI has even launched a search engine, right? A slightly different one than Google, but it's a search engine. And I think there's a whole sort of class of new companies that are helping people build AI optimized sort of SEO strategies, not just creating the articles with AI, but actually like tailoring your SEO strategy to show up in chatbot responses. I feel like that probably means that building authority is actually more important now than it was before. What are your thoughts on that? And sort of, have you guys dove into that at all?
I think the part of our strategy for SEO that's been the most successful, as our editorial director, Mike Haney, likes to say, is how do we add value to the internet? So focusing on what are the topics that are insufficiently covered. People really do engage with our content. I think our average read time is something like 4 minutes, which is just unheard of for this type of content. Because people, if you write content that people want to read, then they will read it. It's kind of as simple as that. If you make garbage content, people won't read it. They'll click on your stuff, and you can have all these vanity metrics of like, look at how many people clicked on it. But then you look at the read time and it's about 15 seconds. They get to it. They're like, oh, this is garbage AI generated stuff. And then they leave. And you can say, yeah, but we got 8,000 clicks on that article. But that means nothing. Google knows what good content looks like. And so you end up ranking pretty highly for things when you have really good content. So it takes a real investment and it takes a long time for it to pay off. You can actually track a lot of this because we publish all of our investor updates publicly from day one of the company. You can go to our website, levels.com, go to the very bottom in our footer. All of our investor updates from day one are public. So you can see our SEO strategy evolve from day one. And what you'll see is for the first, 6 to 12 months, we would celebrate when we would get 400 or 500 views on an article. And over time, that started to grow. And as the quality continued to increase, that's that long tail to the point where we're getting millions of views now. So it takes if you have confidence that that strategy is going to work for you, it does take a while before you start seeing results, but it really does compound in a really positive way.
You guys have put out content across tons of different channels, not just the articles, but the podcasts, appearances, YouTube channel, Instagram. How have you guys thought about sort of allocating time and attention and budget across the different channels at different kind of stages of the company's growth?
The simplest answer on where you focus your effort is where you're seeing the most ROI. And it changes at different points in time for the company. Like early on, we put very little effort into email because when you have 1,000 people that are subscribed to your email, your newsletter, it just doesn't matter. You can put as much effort as you want into it and nothing's going to happen. At a certain point, we got to like 50,000, 100,000, 200,000 people receiving our newsletter. I think we're now at like 500,000. And at a certain point, you start to do the math. Like, well, if we get a 1% conversion rate on these newsletter campaigns, suddenly that's a material amount of money. So what if we did a nurture campaign, which is pretty standard in the industry? What if we built in all these different email lifecycle campaigns? Suddenly those become ROI positive. So I think you have to do the math on where you're getting leverage and where ultimately you're going to see that return on investment. In the early days for us, podcasts were a huge thing. We got a lot of leverage from podcasts. And then at some point, started seeing less leverage from podcasts. So we switched to email lifecycle. And at some point, you kind of maxed out the ROI from spending time there, and you start investigating other things. So I think that's kind of the answer is you gotta do the math on where you get leverage and focus on those things.
I think another benefit with sort of having that many services and being in front of people in all these different places is that good content at least, can help with recruiting too. I've hired a bunch of people from Twitter. People have responded to my newsletter that we've ended up working together. How do you see that playing out for you guys, or how have you seen that playing out for you guys? And does the quality of candidates differ based on different channels?
We publish a lot more content than is typical. As I mentioned, all of our investor updates are public. Up until recently, all of our team all hands were even public. Those are also just in the footer of our website. You can basically see what it's like working here before even working here. We have an internal company podcast. It's just teammates talking to other teammates about things within the company. Some of it's company history, some of it's cultural values, some of it's just like a debate on different topics. So I think that's something that is really what I've noticed over time is the people who apply for jobs at levels, every person that we have hired in the last 5 years is more bought in and more values aligned than the people we had before. Because there's so much more information available that people know what they're signing up for. People opt in. In network theory, they call this preferential attachment, where you get the right kinds of people who are seeking you out. It's why there's this compounding effect for VC firms like Sequoia or Andreessen, where they're no longer grinding it out, trying to find the right companies, because those companies are seeking them out. It makes your job a lot easier when you don't have to do the heavy lifting.
Yeah. I mean, do you think you can get that to a place where, as an early stage new founder, you shouldn't even really think about hiring recruiters or working with external recruiting firms? Can you hack that basically right away? Or is that something that only comes into play a couple years in?
It's not that it comes into play a couple of years in. I think it does compound. So the more of it you do, the more of it you'll get. I did a little bit of analysis on where our first 50 employees came from. The plurality came from just my own network. People that I reached out to, people that I've worked with in the past, just talking to people and trying to get people to join. And I think one of the things that is often missed in a lot of these things is that it's okay to hire somebody who was the right fit for 2, 3, 4 years, and then they're not the right fit later. And that's okay. This is not like a failure of them or you. It's just different people at different stages. I think it's often the case for first-time founders where they don't totally understand or appreciate that, and it feels like a personal failure or some sort of a bad thing that's happening. But it's okay. This is just the nature of building companies. Think of the first 4 or 5 engineers that we've hired. Only one of them is still with the company, and so it's okay. As the team grows, as the needs change, it's okay to make changes there.
Okay, I want to talk about one of my favorite things that you guys have done. We talked a little bit about this before, but basically you decided to turn your co-founder into an influencer. It was like a conscious decision that you made.
Yeah.
And then you actually pulled it off and like it worked. I've seen startups sort of bring in established creators as like pseudo co-founders later on, but it's really rare to see someone sort of intentionally build one of their co-founders up into an influencer and then actually have the content like chops, I guess, to make that happen. So why did you know so early on that was going to be something that you wanted to do and also that you could do with the limited resources that an early stage startup has?
To answer the first question of how do we know something that we wanted to do, it was just we knew that this was achievable in our category. So within the context of health and wellness, this is a thing that already has a pretty established pattern for people who are influential, who are trusted, who people follow, and who people listen to. We're not trying to invent a new category. This is already a very large category with a lot of people who have done this very successfully. So that was a useful indication. I think another was my co-founder, Casey. She also really wanted to do it, and she was very good at it. So you have to have somebody who enjoys it. As a sort of an aside here, almost everybody we talked to said, when we do podcasts or media or anything external, I have to be the one to do it because I'm the CEO. And I said, well, I don't enjoy it, so I'm not going to do it. That's pretty much it. So either we're not going to do them or somebody else is going to do it. And so Casey happens to enjoy it and she's really good at it. So she started doing it. She got a lot of practice in. Eventually, she just became absolutely exceptional at it. And so we put more resourcing into it, building up her personal brand, building in that distribution, and it worked really well. To the question of how did we know that we could do it with the limited resourcing that we had, the answer is you never actually know. You just have to give it a try. I think oftentimes people give up on these things too early. The goal was to do something like 100 podcasts, for Casey to do like 100 podcasts in the first year. And I think she ended up doing somewhere between 100 and 200. She did a lot of podcasts and she got really, really good at it. So you just have to get the reps in sometimes. I talk to other friends and founders who say like fundraising is so hard. It's like, how many pitches have you done? Like 0. Like, well, you're probably not going to get very good at it. I've pitched hundreds and hundreds of times. So it's not like I have some magical ability. I've just done it so many times that I know what to look for and I know how to do it.
I guess saying the goal is 100, that's a big goal, right? That's a time consuming goal. I imagine that you guys did some check-ins sort of along the way to see, oh, is this actually driving ROI? What was that like? What did you look for?
I mean, you can say it's a big goal, but the math doesn't actually pan out that way. Like if you assume, let's say a founder of a company is working, we'll round down, we'll say 50 hours a week, right? You're a tech founder. If you're working 50 hours a week, like you're on the low end of how many hours people are working. But let's just use that number because it's like an easy round number. And let's say you're doing podcasts, right? Let's say it takes 2 hours to record each one. And let's say it takes 3 hours to prep for every podcast, right? If all you're doing is podcasts, that means you're doing 10 podcasts a week, 5 hours, that's 3 plus 2. That's 5 hours, that's 10 podcasts a week. That's pretty achievable to do 100. If that's your full-time job, that's not even a full quarter of work. It's just like, just do this for this quarter. That's your goal, to do 100 podcasts. The reality is, as you start doing more of them, that 3 hours of prep starts to crunch down into like sometimes 0 hours of prep. So really, you can probably do that within a month or two if you're really diligent about it. There's an infinite number of podcasts out there. Like some random person in their basement. If your goal is just to get reps in, there are really an infinite number of podcasts, especially in the health and wellness category. So just getting reps is really a good way to go about it. And it's not that time consuming. If you were to tell one person on your team, this is your only goal for the next 2 months is to do 100 podcasts, you can absolutely do it.
Maybe where I get tripped up there is saying that one person on the co-founding team's only goal is podcasts, like especially early on. That sounds like a big decision, right? Because every founder's time is so valuable. So I guess what made it clear that it kept being worth it to keep investing that time in podcasts for you guys?
You can say it's a big investment, but most people spend a lot of their time just wasting it on things that are really not directed towards anything that delivers value. So I think being really clear about what your strategy is and trying to deliver against something. If it's really obvious that it's not working, then you move on. But you've got to give it a fair shake. And spending, it's like, oh, you did one podcast that has 100 listeners and it didn't drive your growth numbers. It's like, well, obviously, it takes a long time to do these things. So we knew that we needed to get practice, we needed to get reps, so that eventually we can get on these much larger podcasts. And that eventually did happen. So it takes a lot of practice to get to the point where you can confidently go onto some of these really large podcasts and deliver value for their audiences.
Okay, let's talk about sourcing the podcast then. Because I think you mentioned there's so many different podcasts, tiny ones, 100 listeners, right? I guess first question is, how do you pick which of the small ones to get reps with? And then the second question is, once you do that, how do you break in and actually get on the larger ones?
For the first one, it starts again with what are your goals? If your goals are just to get reps in, it really doesn't matter. Do any podcast that will have you on. That's where you should start. We separate out our podcasts from internally. We have 3 different tiers. A tier 1 podcast is like somebody who shows up in the iTunes store as like a top recommended podcast. It's like Peter Attia's podcast, Dr. Hyman's podcast. There's a lot of these tier 1 podcasts. A tier 2 podcast is one that is usually smaller audience, but generally a really engaged audience on a specific topic. So it's not like a mainstream podcast, but they're credible and they have an engaged audience. And then a tier 3 podcast is like a new podcast or something where it's somebody's hobby project. It's not something that has a huge audience, but if we have capacity, if we want some practice, those are really good podcasts to do. So start anywhere is really what I would say. Your first several podcasts are probably going to be terrible. And the interesting thing is, like, nobody's going to listen to it. Nobody cares. So people are always afraid if I do a really bad job on this one podcast, it's going to be like this horrible, shameful thing. The reality is nobody cares about you or your message or your podcast. Nobody cares. One of the things that we see a lot when people from larger companies come to startups, they're always deathly afraid to release things that are too early or not finished enough or not polished enough. And I remember having a conversation with somebody on our team where I wanted to ship an early version of the product way before it was good. It was actually really terrible. And he said, what if the New York Times sees this and runs a thing about how bad this product is? I was like, if you can make a product that is so bad that the New York Times decides to cover it, I will give you $1 million. The odds of that happening is so infinitesimally small that I'm willing to give major odds that this is not going to happen because nobody cares. So same thing with these podcasts. If you do a tiny podcast that nobody listens to, nobody cares. So getting reps, that's the first thing you got to do until you're good at it. And then over time, you can work towards bigger podcasts. People want to know that you're credible. If you can say, look, I did these 3 podcasts, and they can listen to them and say, oh, this person is really articulate and interesting. And I think they could add some value to our audience. I think where people often get mixed up in this is they say, oh, well, I've already said this content one time on the internet, so nobody will ever want to hear it again. It's like, yeah, 90 people in the world listen to that. If that podcast has no distribution, nobody has actually heard this before. There's like this egocentrism where people say like they go on some podcast, like everyone that I know must have listened to this. Nobody has listened to it. Even if you do the biggest podcast in the world, most people will not listen to it. So you have to do a lot of reps. And so how do you end up getting on those larger podcasts is you just work your way up. A lot of times they'll hear about you. You'll do a tier 2 podcast, and then somebody from a tier 1 podcast hears that episode and they say, wow, this person might actually be really good. Sometimes they'll reach out to you. Sometimes you reach out to them. You meet them at a conference. You talk to them about it. They say, it might be interesting to have you on our podcast. I would say one of the things that's also really important is to really focus on what value you can bring to their audience. The podcast host is always thinking about topic, audience, fit. How do you make sure that the topic that you want to talk about or that you're qualifying to talk about or you can speak about articulately will resonate with the audience? So I can give a specific example. I was invited on a podcast recently. It's actually quite a large podcast. And I was talking to the host about it. And I said, look, you have a really great podcast, but I usually talk about corporate knowledge systems and startup team communication and nerdy startup stuff. And what your podcast talks about is completely different than that. Nobody is coming onto your podcast to hear me talk about startup stuff. So somebody who might be more relevant is Casey or Josh on our team. So different people have a different match with those audiences. So I think that's something to really keep in mind. And if you write up a Notion doc of here's what I think we should talk about, and you send that to them proactively. Do the work. That goes a really long way. When they know who their audience is, what will resonate with them, and you're willing to do the work for them, it really makes a big difference.
Yeah, I think before we chatted, you sent over so many materials that you guys have done before,
Yep.
and we used that as part of our research for the episode. So it makes total sense. Made my job easy. Let's think about the audience then, right? Let's say a founder is listening to this, goes and takes this strategy and starts doing these podcasts. What's the next step? Because I think you get on a podcast, great. You talk about your message, great. Maybe some people find your app or your website, or your product, or whatever. But what's the funnel, right? Where do you want people to go?
It'll depend a lot on the podcast. Some of the podcasts that we do, the intent is to get new candidates for recruiting. I did a podcast on the Tim Ferriss show, and the topic was on delegation. And the whole reason for that podcast was to get TypeScript engineers to apply for jobs at levels.
Did it work?
Oh yeah, we got a ton of people apply. So it was very successful in that regard. Doing recruiting is really expensive and tedious and time consuming. And every time you get a lead who deeply understands your company and culture before even applying is really, it saves you a lot of effort. This is the preferential attachment note from earlier. So other times when my co-founder Casey goes on a really big tier 1 health podcast, the goal is to get those people to convert into customers. And so you just, there is one other interesting thing about podcast ads and other podcast related metrics is you have to, when you're calculating your customer acquisition costs, you have to use some sort of a weighted CAC, because your attribution for podcasts is not 100%. You're going to get a lot more people sign up who will say like, oh, I heard about you from this podcast. And sometimes it's a podcast they heard like 6 months ago. So they're not going to click on the link. And so whenever you're doing the math on that, you got to weight your CAC. Sometimes it's a 2x, sometimes it's a 3x. You kind of have to use some judgment on what your weighting is there. Similarly, if you're using Meta ads or Google ads, they will aggressively over attribute. Anybody who has seen anything in the last year related to your content, they will claim that as a conversion. And so when they say, yeah, this one's one of ours, you have to weigh that like 0.2. Like anything that they say was an actual conversion, you got to weigh that in the opposite direction. So you've got to figure out where these numbers are. There's I never really like the saying it's an art, not a science, because it's usually, in my experience, just an excuse for lazy thinking. But there is a degree of judgment that is required to be able to make good decisions around these types of attribution.
So it's usually a science, but in this case, it actually is kind of a little bit of an art.
Well, I think it's still a science. It's just a science that is not, it's not a particularly precise science. So it requires some judgment. And over time, you can get better at making those hypotheses and seeing if your judgments are correct. If you're constantly over or under attributing over time, you eventually figure that out. So I think there's a degree of judgment that's required to make good decisions.
I think that judgment was also probably super important. That same type of judgment is super important when you guys were first setting things up for Casey, right? Because
yep.
You mentioned how it's been proven that people can become large creators in this niche. There's an appetite for it. You can see what content formats are maybe working for them. But if a niche is crowded and there's a lot of people in it, like how do you know you can carve out sort of a new place for someone new to come into it? So I guess just like walk me through how you identified that gap for her specifically.
You can always convince yourself not to do something. Like you can lead with, oh, it's too crowded, so it's not worth doing. Or you can say, nobody's really done this before. There's no evidence that there's a market here, so we just shouldn't do it. So you can always convince yourself that it's not going to work. I think it comes back to talking to customers, using some judgment. I would interview somebody and I'd hear their backstory. Why are they interested in health? Where do they get their information from on these topics? And they would say, oh, I follow X person on Instagram and I listen to these 8 podcasts. It's a pretty good sign. Like, what if that X person on Instagram was one of our people? And what if we went on all 8 of those podcasts? we're going to capture a lot of that same kind of person who would convert into a Levels customer. So finding those people, and I think this was an interesting maybe anecdote from the early days of Levels when we'd ask people questions like, what are products that you view as similar to Levels? What are other health related practices that you have? Just trying to learn as much as we can about people. And something that we found that was true in the early days, I'm sure it's not true anymore, but we found that people who own a Peloton and practice intermittent fasting have a 100% conversion rate into Levels customers. But for some reason, those two things, our guess was they've displayed a willingness to spend $2,000 and they're up to speed on what people are paying attention to in health. And the combination of those two means this is a product that they will buy. So the only way that you find out that stuff is just by talking to people, sending out surveys, whatever it is. You're not going to get that information. It's all qualitative, and you start picking up these trends. It's like, oh, I've noticed these 5 podcasts come up over and over and over again. And like it seems like there's a trend here where a lot of people are following these folks on Instagram. So you just have to display some judgment and be able to think strategically about how to execute on that.
Okay, so then you've kind of figured out, hey, maybe this will work. Maybe you're seeing some early signs that it will. Casey has tons and tons of followers now. Her account's huge. What did you sort of do along the way to keep that growth going? Because I think if anyone can get a couple thousand followers or something like that, how do you get to the level she's at now?
A lot of it is just dedicated effort. I mean, this was her full-time role for years. So her primary role was externally facing. So getting those reps, she had a chief of staff, she had admin support, she had the whole growth team behind her, she had a multimedia team helping her make assets. So it takes real effort to build these things. Like we probably put in the range of millions of dollars building that. Over time, as you're seeing traction, you see what's working and you can commit resources to it. But it was a big lift.
So I think the sort of other way to approach it is just partnering with existing creators who have these audiences in those niches. Obviously, you gain more leverage by kind of owning that yourself with someone on your team, and you have more control. If you were starting from scratch, like the founder listening to this, starting from scratch, how would you think about the trade-offs between those two routes?
We never really considered bringing someone on externally who already had an audience because it's usually much cheaper to just work with them as affiliates or partners. So yeah, it's not really something that we had considered. I guess this may be the short answer.
Did you consider partnering with them as affiliates kind of at scale?
Oh yeah, we already do. Yeah. We work with a lot of people in this category as medical advisors, as affiliates, as sponsors, as partners. There's a lot of different ways that you can structure those. Bringing on somebody as a co-founder needs to be more than just basically a sales relationship. You need to be able to add value in a lot of different places.
What should founders know if they've never done those creator partnership affiliate type deals before? What should they know about kind of entering into that world?
There's a lot of variability. I think that's one. It's just, it comes with the territory. Like some of the affiliate deals that we thought would be like a slam dunk just did not perform at all. Sometimes they didn't perform at all for like months. And then all of a sudden they start seeing traction and you have no idea why. Other times the like tiny niche creators end up being super high ROI. Even a company like ours with a lot of experience doing this, our ability to predict which of these will be successful is surprisingly limited. So I think it just takes a lot of shots on goal.
Yeah, I mean, this is another case of those spikes, right? It's kind of a different kind of spike because you have kind of more control, more shots on goal that you get. But, just talking about virality, the vast majority of any account's followers are going to come from those spikes, right? You're going to build your audience through those moments that break through into the zeitgeist. How do you increase your hit rate on those as much as you possibly can?
It again kind of comes down to judgment. Once you've been doing it for a while, I definitely recommend, if you're in growth, in partnerships, talking to other people in the category, because you can get a lot of intel. And you can also share a lot of intel. So some of our best affiliates came from other companies that are in our category that we've talked to. Let's say they're adjacent to our category. They're still in health and wellness, but not competitive in any way. And we would share like, hey, these are the 5 creators that are working really well for us. And they'll say, oh, these are the 5 that are working really well for us. And then you can cross-pollinate and you can see how those perform. Some of those have performed extremely well. Some of those completely fell flat. And so there's it's not always super explainable why that's the case, but it is one of those things that you've got to experiment. One of the other challenges is we had one specific example recently where a partner that we expected to perform really well just didn't. And sometimes you just pull the plug on it, but we had this intuition, like this should be performing better. So we continued to work with that person. And then a couple cycles later, it really started to pick up and started converting. Why? Don't really know. Not really a lot had changed. It's just sometimes it takes 3 or 4 exposures and then people start to really convert. It's unclear. So if you have a strong intuition, is it useful sometimes to just keep pushing and see what happens? Other times you got to pull the plug early and make changes.
I think another thing that happens when that happens is that it can be totally disruptive to your day, right? Like if you have one of these posts that goes crazy viral, millions of impressions, if it's on your own content or your co-founder's content, in your case, notifications blowing up all day, it sucks you in. It takes up that time. And if it's from another source, all these new customers, many of them might be having problems kind of onboarding, figuring things out. How do you kind of like stay focused and not let that sort of just like totally derail your day, or should you just lean into it?
I think it kind of depends. So I think for the vast majority of your team, you should not. You should be really clear on what your priorities are and not let recency determine your priorities. If your goal is to be externally facing and to be responsive to these things, then that's what you should do. So Casey spent a lot of her time responding to people on Instagram, being super responsive with her DMs, building this zeitgeist, building this movement, because that was a big part of the role. So I think it can suck up a lot of energy from people who really have other things that they should be focusing on. So just, I guess, being really clear on what your priorities are and then do those things.
Okay, so let's talk about this as like a broader strategy, right? We talked earlier that spiky growth, non-repeatable growth on like the PR side, not necessarily as appealing. Spiky growth where maybe it's a little more controllable, but there's still these unknowns on the content side. Like, do you feel like aiming for that with your content, like going after virality specifically, is a good strategy? Or do you think it's better to maybe put out less content, but have it be extremely high quality, well-produced content?
I think it'll depend a lot on what your business is. In our case, in health and wellness, people are looking for credible, high quality content. People have a hard time trusting different sources. So if you look at a lot of our ultimate guides on our blog, they have 30, 40, 50 scientific references. We put a lot of work, thousands, sometimes tens of thousands of dollars of research into some of these pieces. We want to make like the ultimate resource on the internet for this topic. So in our case, building the really high quality material is way more important than building catchy viral content, because there's already a lot of that and it already undermines enough trust. So getting views and impressions is not really the goal. If your company is like the Dollar Shave Club or the Squatty Potty or like these other consumer companies where virality is really the most important thing, then that's what you should optimize for. Like building a high quality 50 scientific references editorial team around razor blades, probably a complete and utter waste of time. So I think knowing who your audience is and how you engage with them is really going to determine how you approach that.
A hot topic right now is the importance of followers. I think we've seen the shift to algorithmic feeds kind of across the board. TikTok has pushed this heavily. Other platforms have adopted it. Do you think algorithms are at a point where they're good enough where your follower count or the follower count of the creators you partner with maybe doesn't matter as much and it's more just about the content itself? Or do you think that there still is a purpose of like building that follower base on a platform?
Well, I think this ties back again to what the goals are, your customers. In health, trust and credibility is extra important because it's already hard enough to know what is true or healthy. So having an individual who you trust that you follow, I think is a lot more important for us than it would be for other people. So I think it's really, again, comes back to what are your customers looking for? If they're looking for amusement, if they're looking for something that's like an impulse purchase, then you probably don't need deep trust and credibility with your audience. You just need something that captures their attention. If a lot of people who purchase our product have been following us and reading our newsletter for 6 months before they finally make a purchase, I think the median time to purchase is like 3 to 6 months. So that means there's a lot of education. There's a lot of trust building that happens there. So it's not like somebody sees an ad and like, oh, that looks cool, I'll just buy that right now. It's much less common for us than it would be for other types of businesses.
When you have a product that is creating a new category like you guys have done, I think a lot of startups end up spending even the majority of their time early on in sort of just generating awareness rather than kind of doing direct sales. But you guys started selling, I think, while it was still in closed beta before the product was even like fully available to folks. Well, why did you decide to focus on that so early?
The ultimate proof of product market fit is that people are willing to give you money for your thing. That's it. I had a conversation with somebody recently who she said, we have product market fit. People just aren't buying it. It's like, okay, what does that mean? Like, well, we get great feedback. We built this amazing product and everyone tells us how great it is, but people just aren't buying it. It's an interesting definition of product market fit. I think what she's saying is people are qualitatively telling us that they like our product, but we don't have product market. There's a reason why they call it product market fit. If there's no market, people are not willing to pay you money. You don't have product market fit. Right? You just have something. So I think I really wanted to validate that people were willing to pay money for this thing before we even started the company. I think a lot of our early customers just sent me money on Venmo. That was enough validation for me. Like, wow, if we can get 20, 50, 100 people to go through this janky process with a really terrible product because we solve a large enough problem for them, it's a really good sign. So I think you've got to collect money. You have to prove that people want your thing early.
Yeah, I mean, the market in product market fit, it's an economic activity, right? A market is an economic thing. You can't just sort of expect it to be field of dreams where people start showing up just because, right? That's not the real world.
For sure. And as I often tell first-time founders in particular, it's not if you build it, they will come. In software, it's really the opposite, which is if they come, you will build it.
Right.
Because you can build pretty much anything in software, and it's actually not that hard. Finding a market where people are willing to pay you money to solve a problem is a lot harder than building software.
Yeah, you get such a good sense of sort of who your ICP is that you whittle down the amount of uncertainty that exists with the startup as much as you can, as quickly as you can. I guess, how did you guys see that play out with the hardware product though? Because you had to invest in actually building that side of things too.
Yeah, we don't make the hardware. So Abbott and Dexcom are the two manufacturers of the sensors. So for us, it's a novel application of existing technology that people were generally not familiar with. So we knew that the education burden would be significant. We'd have to teach people about this whole new category of things. If you're selling something like, I don't know, shoes, if you're selling something that people are already seeking, it can be your cost to acquire customers can be relatively low. If you have to educate people about a new market and a new product that they've never even thought about before, it can take months of education to get people to the point where they understand what it is and they're willing to purchase it. You have to know early on what type of problem are you going to solve and how do you intercept those people. And if you know that this is something that's novel and new for people, how do you teach them what it is? And generate that demand.
Yeah, I mean, you guys obviously did a very good job of this. Maybe I'm too close to the target market here, but I felt like I was seeing tons of my friends wearing the patch basically right away as soon as I heard about you guys a few years ago. So I guess, yeah, how did you sort of pull that off so quickly, get over that challenge?
I think the nice thing about having a physical product is that people see it. So it's way more visible. There are, I'm sure, many, many software products that had much more rapid penetration than we did, but you would have never known about it because it's not physically on their body. Like, it's like if you're selling a hat, people are literally wearing it on their head and you can just see it. There it is. That's a major advantage that we had in terms of virality and word of mouth. That's why still today, a pretty significant percentage, I think it's 20-30% of our inbound comes from referrals from friends because people see it and they ask, what is that? It's a novel thing. And then people explain it and then they want to see for themselves. So it definitely has some virality factor there.
Kind of a common thread throughout this conversation has been the, sort of the value you get from investing in putting yourself out there and through your own channels and sort of building up a broader network around your product, right? And the awareness of your product. Obviously very important for you guys early on, did it very well. How much time should a founder be spending on sort of building up that broader network around the product, not just maybe for customers, but also for, as we mentioned, hiring? And you guys even did it for investors really well too.
This is another one of those things that sort of a lazy answer, but depends on what your goals are. I think it's really helpful to have somebody who's really well connected in the investor base, be able to if you're 1 degree separated from any investor that you'd want to talk to, really helps to have that credibility where people are comfortable and confident introducing you to people that you want to talk to. When it comes to hiring your first set of people on your team, knowing the people that either are the people you want to hire or are 1 degree separated from those people is also really important. This ties into this broader concept in network theory called eigenvector centrality. It's one of the types of connectedness within a network, which is it's the number of people that you know, but it's also 1 degree beyond that. It's actually n degrees beyond that, which is how many people do all of those people know? So it's one thing to be very well connected in a small network of people, but if you're connected to all of those super connected people in their networks, that's really, really high leverage. So I think that's something that's really underappreciated is the larger the network that you have access to and the trust that you build in those groups, the more reach it gives you across all different categories of people. So it's the question of how much time should people be spending on it. I think it kind of depends, of course, on what your goal is. But what I have found is people are usually a lot less intentional about what it means to like finger quotes network. It's like the number of times I've been at these conferences where I like meet random people and they give me their business card and scurry off. It's like, does that person think that he just networked? Like, what are we doing here? That was really weird. So I think it's about being really intentional with what your goals are and building genuine relationships. A lot of my most important connections in work and in life were not people that I sought out. They were not things that I had any sort of goal beyond just, this is an interesting person and I'm going to spend time with them. In other work contexts, it can get really easy to be just sucked into, oh, I'm going to another tech conference. I'm going to meet more tech people. But there's a point of diminishing returns. If you work in venture, does knowing another person in venture really help you build your network? Probably not. If you work in finance, does knowing another person in finance really help you? If you're a lawyer, meeting the 2000th lawyer, does that really help you expand your network? Probably not. But meeting somebody that's in a totally different network who has access to a lot of different information is probably a lot more useful.
But you guys applied that theory really well to fundraising, right? I think you had something like 150 people. Mm-hmm. A lot of them were like pretty unrelated to each other on the cap table early on. And was that important for distribution? Like, how did that help?
It really helped across the board. It helped in distribution. It helped especially in the early days when you kind of have no idea what you're doing. If you have questions on regulatory, if you have questions on marketing strategy, if you have questions on editorial, if you have questions on certain product decisions, if you have questions on how to get in touch with certain people, having a really large network of people who have experience in these things can help you a lot. The difference between trying to figure it out yourself and having a 30-minute conversation with somebody who just knows the answer can save you a lot of pain. So we've gotten a lot of value from that expansive network of investors and advisors that we have.
So for somebody who maybe first time founder, they don't have those connections with, influential people, investors, even creators, what should they be doing? Should they be even going after starting a venture-backed company right now, or should they just focus on sort of building up the nodes in that network early on in an authentic way?
You can start a venture-backed company with no connections. It's just a lot harder. Kind of the simple answer. So you kind of do it however you want to do it. It's knowing all the people that you're going to hire for your initial team and building that trust over 5 or 10 years to the point where they want to join your company. It makes it a lot easier, but there are lots of people who have done it without having those connections. So I don't think it's a requirement. It's more like it will definitely accelerate the process.
The founders that I see doing really well with content and kind of succeeding with it, like you guys have done, is that they build repeatable systems, right? They invest in not just going out and creating one piece of content, but building a system, sort of like how you're talking about you did around Casey, right? With these other resources.
Yep.
I imagine the delegation plays into that quite a lot. You have this incredible first round review piece that I totally recommend everyone go read about how you have like a team of assistants helping out with various things across the business and for you personally. What's been the value of that? Is that something you'd recommend people to invest in early on? And kind of how does that work?
Yeah, I think support staff is generally undervalued and underappreciated. I think people can get a tremendous amount of leverage from relatively inexpensive labor helping them with tasks. When I say relative, I mean it specifically, which is your time relative to the time of your admin. Freeing up your time to do other things that are higher leverage is worth a lot more than the cost of hiring that support person. So we have 40 people on our team. I think we have 20 admins that are supporting. So we get quite a lot of leverage from that team. They do everything from managing a big chunk of our legal function to our finance function to our HR function to helping keep on top of how people are posting about us on social. They really, across the entire company, we're able to get leverage there so that our people on our core team can really focus on the highest value things.
Yeah, building that leverage, that's how you accelerate. That's how you kind of get out of the rut of early stage startup often.
Yeah.
Cool. Okay. We have like a little rapid fire outro that we like to do.
Let's do it.
Or quick questions. Okay. So name one investor who other founders should take capital from and why.
I mean, this is not going to be a particularly obscure answer, but I think Andreessen Horowitz has been a great partner. If you pay attention and you're willing to put in some work yourself, they have a lot of resources at their disposal that you can leverage to do a lot, more than any other firm I've ever seen. So if you're willing to put in the work, you can get a lot out of it.
Yeah, that was my experience as well. They went above and beyond time and time again, and they have so much that they can offer. Okay. What's one thing, it can be broad, one thing that you'd change about the startup world?
I'm not sure how to change this, but I think the risk tolerance of venture has decreased substantially over the last 10 or 20 years. I think venture historically has been people who take a lot of risk on very early bets for potentially world-changing technology. And it seems like a lot more of venture today is basically just replacing price to earnings ratios with LTV to CAC ratios or like revenue multiples. It seems like there's been it's just been a blending of what venture used to mean of what private equity means now. So I think I would probably say I would like to see more risk tolerance I was talking to somebody about this not too long ago. I think the incredible returns and risk profile, meaning extremely low risk of B2B SaaS, has sort of broken what venture even means. So I wish there was more risk tolerance for some of these bigger bets.
Yeah, I totally agree. And that's sort of grown in tandem with just the proliferation of new managers and new funds trying to make sort of a name for themselves.
Yeah.
Okay, next one. What's your number one piece of advice for a brand new first-time founder?
Talk to customers.
Done. Check. And then what's something, this is a Peter Thiel one. What's something you believe that most people disagree with you about?
I have a lot of those, so I'm trying to pick which one would make the most sense.
Pick your favorite.
I think one that we've seen a lot of benefit from is I think there's this assumption of how a manager direct report relationship should operate. I have, I think, 20 direct reports, and I spend very little of my time on one-on-ones, and it works extremely well. And I think there's this default of one manager per 8 direct reports, and you just like cookie cutter that. I'm not a big believer in having a manager class at all. I actually don't think it should exist. I think one of our cultural values, which we stole from Airbnb, is leaders are in the details. People need to know how their function works. So people might have direct reports, but they're not a manager. They are a person who delivers value, and they have people who report to them. And that relationship doesn't have to be the personal therapist of everyone on their team. I think you can have a different style of relationship if that's what you're optimizing for. I think having more direct reports with a different set of expectations can solve problems much more quickly. It reduces many, many layers of that game of telephone for decisions to get made. You can make decisions a lot faster. So I think making fewer assumptions about how you have to do things is a big one when it comes to that type of relationship.
Basically, you're in founder mode.
Yeah, for sure.
Cool. Well, Sam, thanks so much, man. This was great. Where can folks find you? Where should folks go to learn more about Levels?
I'm Levels is just levels.com. That's easy to find us there. And I'm on Twitter or X, just at Sam Korkos.
Cool. Thanks, man.
Sure thing.
Thanks for listening. I write up my main takeaways from every conversation and make them available to all of our members at foundingjourney.com, along with a bunch of other perks and more content. If you found this conversation valuable, subscribe to Founding Journey on Spotify, YouTube, Apple Podcasts, or whatever your favorite podcast app is. I post a new episode every Thursday. Also, consider leaving us a rating or a review. As a brand new podcast, this is the best way for us to get out there and founders to find us. See you next time.